What happened when a man who spent his life invisible suddenly discovers he can control everything around him? Not power in the abstract, not influence in theory, but real control over outcomes, over people, over fear. Most people don't change because they suddenly become different. They change because they finally feel in control. At first, it feels like relief, like clarity, like finally becoming the person you were supposed to be. But control changes how people think. When someone who has always felt small realizes they can shape the world, the question shifts. Not what should I do, but why didn't I do this sooner? Walter White's transformation is not a story about becoming evil. It is a story about what happens when ego and identity finally find a place to grow unchecked. This is the psychology of Walter White. Walter White is not introduced as a criminal. In Breaking Bad, he appears as an ordinary man in his 50s, a high school chemistry teacher, overqualified, underpaid, and largely overlooked. Before the series even begins, his life is already chaperoned by compromise. He once helped build a company that later became enormously successful, but he left early, walked away, and watched others receive the recognition and wealth. What remained was quit resentment, not loud, not explosive, just persistent. Walter's intelligence was never in question. What was missing was status, control, and a sense that his life reflected his potential. Then the pressure arrives, a terminal cancer diagnosis, mounting financial anxiety, and the realization that time, the one thing he cannot control, is running out. This context matters because Breaking Bad is not about a man discovering crime. It is about a man discovering leverage. Through chemistry, Walter finds something he has always had but never fully used: competence. For the first time in his life, his knowledge creates immediate results, clear outcomes, money, respect, even fear. And psychologically, that changes everything. Understanding who Walter White is helps us see that his transformation is not sudden. It is incremental, layered, and deeply tied to ego and identity. Before he becomes Heisenberg, Walter White is simply a man who finally feels seen. For most people, pressure reveals who they already are. For Walter White, pressure did something different. It created a choice. Cancer, financial fear, and lifetime of unfulfilled potential did not force him into the drug world. They narrowed his options until one path felt inevitable. But the decision itself is not the most important part. What matters is why decision made sense to him. To understand Walter White's psychology, we need to look at the first mechanism that pulled him forward. Not greed, not violence, but control. Walter White did not enter the drug world because he wanted chaos. He entered it because it offered structure. For most of his life, Walter felt powerless. His career never reflected his intelligence. His financial situation never reflected his effort, and his identity slowly shrank into roles he did not choose: teaching, medical bills, dependence on others. Psychologically, this creates a specific tension. When a person believes they are competent but lives in a reality that constantly contradicts it, frustration builds quietly, not outward anger, but internal resentment. The drug world changes that dynamic almost immediately. For the first time, Walter not reacting. He is deciding. He chooses when to act. He chooses how to act. And most importantly, he sees direct results from his decisions. Money appears. Problem gets solved. People listen. From a psychological standpoint, this is critical. Control reduces anxiety. It gives the mind a sense of order in a situation that previously felt overwhelming. At first, Walter frames his actions as practical. He tells himself he is protecting his family, that he is doing what must be done. And early on, that belief is not entirely false. But control is not neutral. Once someone experiences control after a long period of helplessness, they become sensitive to losing it. Small threats feel larger, challenges feel personal, and compromise start to feel like weakness. This is where the mechanism shifts. What began as a way to manage fear slowly becomes a way to protect identity. Walter White is no longer just solving problem, he is proving something to himself. Psychologically, this is the danger of control. When control becomes tied to self-worth, letting go feels like disappearing again. There is a positive lesson here. Taking responsibility can be empowering. Using your skill decisively can restore confidence. Regaining agency matters. But there is also a boundary. When control becomes the only source of meaning, everything else becomes a threat. Walter White shows us that control is useful until it replaces self-awareness. The moment control stops being a tool and starts becoming an identity, the direction of change is already set. Control over situations is one thing, control over people is another. As Walter becomes more comfortable making decisions, the problem is no longer whether he can act. The problem becomes whether others will follow. In the beginning, control helped Walter manage fear, but over time, it begins to serve a different purpose, not survival, stability. And to maintain that stability, Walter starts to do something subtle but dangerous. He stops adjusting himself to the situation and starts to adjusting other people instead. That shift marks the next stage of his psychology. As Walter White gains more control over situations, he begins to realize something important. Control is fragile unless other people behave the way you expect them to. This is where manipulation enters the picture. At first, Walter does not see himself as manipulative. He sees himself as logical. He explains. He persuades. He frames situations in ways that make his decisions seem reasonable, sometimes even necessary. Psychologically, this feels justified. When someone believes their thinking is superior, influencing others can feel like guidance rather than control. Walter starts to believe that chaos only appears because people around him are emotional, impulsive, or short-sighted. So he compensates. He withholds information. He decides what others need to know and what they don't. He controls timing, tone, narrative. This is especially visible in his relationship with Jesse. Walter positions himself as the rational one, the teacher, the stabilizing force, and in many moments, this is partially true. Walter is calmer, more strategic, more deliberate, but the psychological shift happens quietly. Jesse stops being partner. He becomes a variable to manage. When someone is reduced to a variable, empathy becomes optional. From Walter's perspective, manipulation is not cruelty, it is efficiency. He believes outcomes matter more than feelings, results matter more than trust. And because those results often work, the behavior reinforces itself. This is the dangerous loop. Manipulation creates short-term stability, but it erodes relationships. And as relationships weaken, control must increase to compensate. Over time, Walter's need for control is no longer about safety, it's about authority. He does not just want things to work, he wants them to work his way. There is a lesson here that applies far beyond the story. Influence is not the same as manipulation. Influence respects autonomy. Manipulation replaces it. Clear thinking can help others, but only if it leaves room for choices. Walter White shows how easily competence can slide into domination when control becomes more important than connection. The moment you stop explaining and start managing people, the relationship has already changed. Manipulating situations and people can maintain control for a while. But control alone is not enough, because beneath Walter's decisions, there is still an unresolved question. Who is he in all of this? At some point, managing outcomes stops being satisfying. What begins to matter is recognition, respect, authority, a name that carries weight. This is where Walter White's psychology shift again. Control turn inward, and identity steps forward. By this point, Walter White is no longer reacting to circumstances, he is choosing them. Earlier, every step could still be explained as survival, providing for his family, protecting himself, maintaining control in a chaotic situation. But something has shifted. Walter no longer asks, "What do I need to do?" He starts asking, "What do I deserve?" This is where ambition quietly replaces necessity. At first, Walter told himself he had no choice. Then he told himself he was doing it for others. Now he tells himself he is the only one capable of doing it right. Psychologically, this matters because identity changes behavior. When people see themselves as the solution, they stop questioning their methods. They stop checking their motives. Success becomes proof that they were right all along. This is something we often see in real life. Competence can slowly turn into entitlement. Results can replace self-reflection. Walter's moral reasoning becomes selective. When his actions succeed, they justify themselves. When they hurt others, the damage is reframed as necessary. Unavoidable, part of process. The lesson here is not about crime or power, it's about how easily goals can rewrite our values. When we tie our worth to outcomes, we become willing to protect the outcome at any cost, even when the original reason no longer exists. Notice how often Walter says, "I did this for my family," but behavior no longer matches the reason. The risk increases, the control tightens, the danger spreads. What grows is not responsibility, it's attachment to control. This shows a psychological trap that applies far beyond the story. When success becomes part of identity, letting go feels like losing yourself. That's why ambition becomes dangerous without reflection. Not because wanting more is wrong, but because unchecked ambition removes internal limits. Walter doesn't fail because he wanted to succeed. He fails because he stopped asking a simple question. Is this still serving the reason I started? And once that question disappears, progress no longer has direction, only momentum. By now, Walter's problem is no longer the world around him. It's the story he tells himself. What began as a response to pressure has become a belief system, a belief that his actions are justified because they work, that his control proves his correctness, that stepping back would mean everything he built was a mistake. And this is where the most dangerous shift happens. When identity, ambition, and success merge, there is no clear line between who you are and what you do. At this point, choices stop being evaluated by consequences. They are evaluated by whether they protect the self-image. This is the moment Walter White stops trying to survive his situation and start defending who he has become. And once someone begins defending an identity, every action can be explained. This is where the final transformation begins. By the final stage, Walter White no longer needs excuses. But for the first time, he also no longer hides from the truth. Throughout the story, Walter builds a narrative about himself, that he is doing what must be done, that he is the only one capable, that the outcome justifies everything. But in the end, that story collapses. Not because someone proves him wrong, but because he finally stops lying to himself. When Walter admits, "I did it for me," it is nor a moment of pride. It is a moment of clarity. Psychologically, this matters. For the first time, Walter separates identity from justification. He sees that his intelligence did not force his actions. His ambition did not require them. His circumstances did not demand them. They only made them possible. This is where regret appears. Not regret for the outcome, but regret for the version of himself he chose to protect. Walter realized that control did not give him freedom. It narrowed him. It replaced curiosity with certainty. connection with dominance. And here is the lesson this story offers. Growth does not end when we succeed. It ends when we stop questioning why we want that success. Walter's downfall was not wanting power. It was refusing to let go of the identity that power created. In real life, this is where self-correction matters most. Before ambition becomes self-definition. Before control replaces honesty. Before success becomes the only lens we use to judge ourselves. Walter White shows us something rare. Not just how people fall, but how they recognize the fall too late. The lesson is not to fear ambition, but to stay honest enough to step away from it before it starts speaking for you. Because the most dangerous moment is not when we want more. It is when we can no longer imagine being anything else. Walter White's story is often described as a warning, a lesson about ego, power, and moral collapse. But that framing is incomplete. Because what makes this story as unsettling is not how different Walter from us, it's how familiar his reasoning feels. He didn't start as a villain. He started as someone who felt small, ignored, cornered by life. And step by step, each decision made sense in the moment. Each choice felt justified. Each line crossed felt temporary, until there were no clear lines left. Walter's psychology shows us something uncomfortable. That intelligence doesn't protect us from self-deception. That good intentions don't prevent harmful outcomes. And that control, when tied to identity, can slowly replace honesty. The most important lesson here is not about crime or morality. It's about self-awareness, about noticing when ambition stops serving a goal and starts serving the ego, about recognizing when the story we tell ourselves becomes more important than the truth. Walter realized this only at the end, when the cost could no longer be undone. So the question this story leaves us is simple. At what point does proving our worth costing us who we are?